But tonight we're focusing on John Sillito, and I've known John since I was at least a teenager, maybe longer. Is that right, John?
It is.
I remember he lived in a neighborhood adjacent to mine, and we knew each other for a long time, and he was close with my father, and I'm honored to have him here with us tonight. I'm going to read from the Signature Books bio, so if I get anything wrong here, John, I apologize. We'll blame it on Devery.
Okay.
John Sillito worked as an archivist and curator at special collections at Weber State University, as well as being a professor of libraries, where he was named the Nye Honors Professor for 2001 to 2002. He co-authored A World We Thought We Knew, Readings in Utah History, of which I have one copy, along with John McCormick, as well as A History of Utah, Radicalism, Startling, Socialistic, and Decidedly Revolutionary, which earned the authors the Best Utah History Book Award in 2012. In the field of Mormon studies, Sillito edited several volumes of personal essays, including The Wilderness of Faith, Essays on Contemporary Mormon Thought. This is from Signature Books. And then later, he also did the volume Mormon Mavericks, Essays on Dissenters. This has some great chapters of some of the well-known dissenters of Mormonism. Another great book that John did. And I think we have a copy or two of Mormon Mavericks. Wilderness of Faith, I have to say, that's the only one I can find in my own personal books here, but if you'd like us to, you're welcome to look at this, and we'd be happy to find one for you. John also has published in the Utah Historical Quarterly, the Sunstone Magazine, and Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. In 2014, the Conference of Intermountain Archivists awarded Sillito the Lifetime Achievement Award, recognizing his 33 years of service and leadership in the archival profession. He is also the editor of two of the Signature Books diaries that were in the Significant Mormon Diaries series. He co-edited Letters from Exile, which is the letters of Martha Hughes and Angus M. Cannon. And then he also did the B.H. Roberts diaries called A History's Apprentice. So John has long known and been familiar with B.H. Roberts, and has finally now published the book that we'll talk about tonight, B.H. Roberts, A Life in the Public Arena. Any questions before we let John take over? Okay. With that, then, I turn the time over to John Sillito and ask for your apt attention. Yeah, you can clip it. Let's just put that in here.
That work?
Yep, if I put it on there. Right there.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
Thank you, sir.
Well, it's bittersweet to be here. I couldn't decide whether I wanted to say anything about Kurt or not, because I didn't want to spend the next half an hour blubbering. But as all of you here do, I miss him tremendously. And I am pleased to be here, and I know he's here in spirit, and that's going to help me get through this. So thank you very much for coming. Thanks to Benchmark for having me. Thanks to Signature Books for publishing me so many times, including this one. Chris mentioned I got a Lifetime Achievement Award. What that means is you're old. When you get really old, they say, well, better give him an award because, hell, you don't know how much longer he's going to be here. And so, for me, that means I can't see anything. I just have to have these glasses on to read, other glasses to see. My handwriting is almost as good as a doctor's. Unfortunately, my salary is a lot less, but I appreciate you being here to talk about an interesting fellow. Brigham, could I take this off while I...
Yeah.
Okay. Brigham H. Roberts, 1857-1933, and can you all hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Good. Was an important public figure in what Tom Alexander calls the era of Mormonism in transition, 1890 to 1930. Roberts was many things during that period: a missionary, general authority, polygamist, politician, historian, and theologian. He ran for Congress twice, was defeated once, and then elected and expelled from Congress because he had 3 wives. I also believe that during these years, 1890, 1933, he was Mormonism's most prominent public intellectual, and we'll talk a little bit about that. When he was at the height of his powers, Roberts may have been known, excuse me 1 minute, I'm not very well organized tonight. Keep an eye on time. Okay, when he was at the height of his powers, Roberts may have been the best known and most recognizable Mormon figure, both within the church and throughout the nation, partly due to the notoriety he gained in the national campaign to deny him a seat in Congress. Many scholars have examined Roberts' life and career. So how does my book differ? Well, it seeks to provide a single-volume account of Roberts, the public person, as a politician, writer, thinker, and above all, an exponent of Mormonism in word and print. It does not examine his role as a theologian. Others, much better qualified to do that, have done so. Nor does it provide an examination of him as a historian. Again, others have done that. At the same time, it is not a family history. My late colleague, Richard Roberts, did that, and I commend that book to you if you're interested in the family. You know, I've literally spent most of the current century trying to understand B.H. Roberts, first through editing his diaries that Chris mentioned, and over the last way too many years working on this biography. Like most biographers, I have an ambivalent relationship with my subject. Sometimes I can't stand him. Other times I don't even see the flaws, and there are many, him and me. On balance, however, I view him as amazing if occasionally annoying. So why the ambivalence? Well, he could be petty, vindictive, arrogant, self-important, and insufferable. A January 4th, 1898 diary entry reads, "Home, SLC, chess, and Dante." I get it. You're a hotshot intellectual. I get it. He struggled with alcohol, and it affected his behavior and his judgment. He battled depression, the black dog, he called it, and sometimes made interpersonal relationships difficult. He wasn't the greatest husband or father, and he admitted it. And his views, as we will see on women's suffrage and race, were hardly enlightened, even for his times. On the other hand, when you consider his rise from the grinding, abject poverty of his early years, followed by his life on the margins as a young man in Utah, it is amazing that he became one of Mormonism's greatest writers, thinkers, and intellectuals. So what do I want to do tonight? Well, I want to explore 3 things. Roberts the polygamist, Roberts the public intellectual, and Roberts the flawed thinker. Now, you may have questions on other topics or aspects of Roberts' life and career, and I'd be happy to try to answer them as best as I can. First, a quick overview of his early life. As most of you know, Roberts was born in England to Mormon converts. His mother, Anne, was a pretty committed Latter-day Saint. His father's, Benjamin's, Mormonism was pretty much perfunctory. And eventually, knowing that her husband would object and never change, Anne decided in 1862, with the help of the PEF, to flee England for Utah. She took 2 of her younger children with her and left 2 others, daughter Mary, who was 12, and B.H., who was then called Henry, in the care of local saints. B.H. was put under the charge of the Tovies, a poor, wandering, alcoholic couple who at various times tried to get rid of him, once even offering him to the army as a drummer boy. I'm glad they didn't take him. We wouldn't be having this event if they had. It was a hand-to-mouth existence from which Roberts ultimately was freed. Along with his sister, and after a long journey across the sea and over the plains, they arrived in Utah in September of 1866. As the group traveled down Immigration Street, which is today's 3rd South, then turned on Main Street, B.H. later recalled in his autobiography, "At the head of the lead yoke in that team, walking up the principal street of the city, the rest of the team following. Here the people had turned out to welcome plains-worn immigrants, and were standing on the street sides to greet them. Along the road, he said, I saw a charming little girl approaching me in the middle of the street. The dainty little lady offered him a fruit basket of peaches, plums, and grapes. Roberts took what he supposed was a reasonable portion, shared them with his sister, who was a good brother, then resumed his place at the front of the train and, in his words, marched on until the head of Main Street was reached. It is a captivating and illuminating scene. One senses that for the first time in a long time, perhaps ever, B.H. Roberts felt he was home. That sense of belonging, geographically and spiritually, would mark him for the rest of his life. And despite the conflicts, defeats, and occasional disappointments that he experienced, B.H. Roberts was to his core both a Latter-day Saint and a Utahn, even if by adoption and not birth. After coming to Utah, Anne had married widower William Nichols, though it's not quite clear whether she formally divorced Ben. After his death, she married Seth Dustin and had her last child with him. B.H. joined his mother living with Seth and his, what he called, unruly sons. He later recalled, for a while I roamed the hills and backcountry. I took my whiskey straight and my coffee black. But it didn't last too long. I could see no future in that. I don't know what it meant, roaming the hills of the whiskey and the coffee, but I got a chance then, he said, to work with a blacksmith. Well, in the midst of this marginal life, a bountiful blacksmith named James H. Baird gave him a chance to apprentice. He lived with the family. It gave him stability for 3 years. It taught him a skill. It led him to the one-room school of Hannah Flint Holbrook, then to John Morgan's Commercial College, and finally the Young Men's Club of Centerville, whose library provided books and ideas, and where, after much effort, he mastered public speaking. In 1877, he married Louisa Smith, daughter of William R. Smith, Davis Stake president, and his plural wife, Emmeline Levitt Smith. With the financial assistance of the local bishop and others, he attended the University of Deseret, where he blossomed. He received a territorial superintendent scholarship, which was repaid by teaching. He became the valedictorian of the class of 1878. Not long after the graduation, Roberts taught school, fulfilling the requirements of his scholarship, then left for his first mission. Initially it was in Iowa, but the climate was hard on his sinuses, and he was ultimately transferred to Tennessee. It was there in August 1884 that two Mormon missionaries, John H. Gibbs and William S. Berry, were murdered at Cane Creek. Roberts, disguised as a tramp, and there's a photo of that in the book, retrieved the bodies and had them returned to Utah. The event gained press attention in Utah, but also throughout the nation. At 27, he was a household name, certainly among the saints, and his prominence, combined with a predisposition, led him toward politics. Okay, let's look at B.H. now as a polygamist. He married Celia Dibble in October 1884. She had been one of his students when he was paying back that scholarship. A few years later, he went to England to escape prosecution for that plural marriage. After returning, he served a prison term for unlawful cohabitation and was then shortly thereafter put on the first quorum of 70. What's very interesting about Roberts is his attitude toward the manifesto. We don't have a diary for 1890, just a reminiscence from 1893. He says that he learned of the manifesto while returning from southern Utah with apostles Francis M. Lyman, John W. Taylor, Abram Buchanan, and John Henry Smith. Initially, he said the Spirit told him, it's okay, it's all right, this is the thing to do. But over time, his companions were divided, and over time he thought, I'm not sure about this, whether this is right or not. He began to reflect on all that the saints, including himself, had suffered, defending the principle. And at that October conference where the manifesto was approved, he said, in the awfulest moment of my life, I could not and did not vote for it. So he had two wives, Louisa and Celia. His third wife was Margaret Curtis Shipp. She was a sister wife of Ellis Shipp, and they were both married to Milford Shipp. The key question is not that they were married, but when they were married. He claimed it was in April 1890 and performed by Daniel H. Wells, who he said had also performed the marriage to Celia. Wells died March 24th, 1891. Okay? So less than a year later. He and Margaret never deviated from that date of 1890. Mike Quinn, on the other hand, is very definitive, as Mike could be. March 19th, 1891 or thereabouts, but certainly not April 1890. I don't know his source. Still, most scholars believe it was a post-manifesto marriage, and the estimates range from 1892 to 1894. Carmen Hardy says Shipp was living with her first husband until at least 1892. Other sources say no, there may have been a cancellation of sealings in 1888 or 1890. One says the marriage was after Milford died. That's not very likely because he died in 1918. The Mormon plague chaser Charles Moistenoam believed that the marriage was in the spring of 1894. Richard Roberts, my late colleague from Weber in his family history, quotes a 2007 letter from the Church History Library's manager of public affairs that they were probably married sometime between late 1892 and 1894. The marriage, this individual said, was post-manifesto, and there's probably no existing paperwork to prove the marriage. Roberts could be disingenuous. In November 1884, when asked by a reporter in Tennessee if he believed polygamy to be legally, morally, and theologically right, he responded that he did, but when he was asked if he practiced it, he replied, not literally or personally. Well, as we've seen, he married Celia the month before. He says he later became reconciled to the principle of the manifesto. But Mike Quinn also writes that in 1893, Roberts preached in Colonia Diaz that plural marriage was a correct principle and will remain on the earth somewhere, and the sun will shine on it forever. Second, let's look at Roberts as a public intellectual. What do I mean by that term, public intellectual? It's the term we hear a lot these days. And there are many definitions. But for my purposes, a public intellectual is someone who engages in intellectual pursuits, expounds intellectual concerns in a way that a broad, literate public can understand, and who is also seen by the general public as authoritative on many different topics and concerns. Well, how did that happen? How did he emerge, this blacksmith from Bountiful? Well, missions were very much a part of Roberts' becoming Mormonism's preeminent public intellectual. He went on several of them at the request of the First Presidency, expounding on the faith, refining his views, and always attracting press attention wherever he went. Another important step in the process was his effort to gain a hearing for the church at the Parliament of Religions in 1893 in Chicago during the World's Fair. While unsuccessful, it garnered a huge amount of publicity, mostly favorable for the church, due to the failure of conference organizers to include Mormonism on the agenda. In addition to these activities, Roberts spoke widely throughout the church, stake and ward conferences, special meetings in the tabernacle, and all of these were widely reported in the press. And frequently he spoke on secular concerns as well. A whole range of them, much of which didn't get in the book. Some did. He mediated strikes. He did all kinds of things that people were aware of. And of course there is his voluminous writing, histories, polemics, theology, even fiction. In books, magazines, and newspapers. Another major step took place in World War I and after. Roberts was an early champion of Wilson's war to make the world safe for democracy and to end all wars. He came home from that war a changed man, very different. He became a strong advocate of world peace, and he was the strongest voice in Utah in favor of the U.S. joining the League of Nations, which didn't happen. He was heard on KSL radio in the early 1930s. Now, I've searched to find a copy of his voice, and I haven't found it. If any of you know where there is one, and I meant to check again down there, and I didn't get a chance. It'd be wonderful to hear his actual voice, but so far I haven't heard it. His views on a variety of subjects were reported locally here in Utah, but also especially when he was the the Eastern States Mission President from 1922 to 1927. These views were widely known in the important newspaper part of the United States. Okay, let's turn to the third point, flawed thinker. Let's start with suffrage. Roberts, because of his involvement in politics, he supported what was then called the Sagebrush Democracy, Utah's Democratic Party, and mostly in the early days on the Davis County level. He was elected to the Constitutional Convention, and it was here that he opposed women's suffrage. The Democrats had declared at their territorial party convention that they were unequivocally in favor of women's suffrage, and he was a Democrat. Roberts was advised by church leaders not to impede passage of a women's suffrage clause in the Constitution. He acted on his own. He knew there was overwhelming support for suffrage, but he also knew there was some opposition. Why oppose it? Why would he choose that? Well, he said his main concern was that adding a women's suffrage plank was dangerous to the acquiring of statehood. He feared Congress would see it as a way to just prevent statehood. I don't see much evidence that that would have happened, but that's what he said. And he offered two key items of opposition to suffrage. First, Roberts told the convention that there was not a suffragist among you that has a higher opinion of women. You know that there's a but coming, right? Okay. Then he did. But, he told his colleagues, the influence of women as it operates upon me never came from the rostrum. It never came from the pulpit with a woman in it, never came from the lecturer's platform with women speaking in it. It came from the fireside. It comes from the blessed association with mothers, sisters, wives, daughters, not as Democrats or Republicans. Okay. Second, Roberts also raised the question of the role suffrage might play if it were granted to women in terms of domestic happiness. It was probably one of his most ill-considered and intemperate remarks, and yet it was probably pretty honest and very revealing. He asked his colleagues to imagine a man who returned home after a hard day from struggling to elect the candidate which he believes will serve the interests of the people, coming home from the sweat and heat of a campaign meeting, tired and weary of the world, only to be met at the door by a wife opposed to him politically, thus forcing him to either go over the fight on the issues of the day or else observe a sullen silence because of the impropriety of engaging in a discussion along these lines. Gentlemen, he implored the delegates, leave the home alone. Keep political strife out of it. Women of Utah, be content to reign over the empires of domestic life, and it will bring more joy to your hearts than all the success you could have in casting your ballots at the polls. Well, he wasn't the only one to hold these views, here or elsewhere. Needless to say, his remarks raised the ire of pro-suffrage forces, regardless of party or gender. Ultimately, the plank was adopted overwhelmingly. Later, the Constitution was ratified overwhelmingly, voted on and ratified. It was accepted by Congress. Now, he later changed his mind and he said, no, I could support suffrage. Well, he wanted to run for Congress. Still, the episode represents, I think, a very serious flaw in Roberts' character. To not understand how important that suffrage was, for whatever reason. Finally, there was a second stain, I think, in many ways more fundamental and more troublesome, and that was the stain of racism. Roberts first came into contact with blacks on his mission in the South. It was 1881, it was at the end of Reconstruction, and only a few years after the war itself. The Klan was active in the South, and they were as much anti-Mormon as they were anti-black. In April 1885, an article in the Contributor, which relies on the Pearl of Great Price and the views of John Taylor, in which he argues that those who had not been valiant in the pre-existence, or who had followed Lucifer, forfeited some privileges. One such group, he said, were the descendants of Ham, who had married Egyptus, a descendant of Cain, who killed his brother and thus was cursed with a mark. Roberts believed that mark, based on the Pearl of Great Price, was a dark skin. He further believed that the black race consisted of those spirits who, while they may not have rebelled directly against God, were not valiant in the great rebellion in heaven, and through their indifference rendered themselves unworthy of the priesthood. Some races, he said, were more faithful and noble and intelligent than others. Those races who were none of these, faithful, noble, or intelligent, possessed a black skin. In 1906, he accompanied George Albert Smith on a special mission, designed in part to assure Southerners three things. First, polygamy was not being practiced currently in Utah. The church did not seek to gather converts to Utah, and that Mormon views on race were similar with theirs. And he addressed that latter point, the similarity, in many places. He said in one place, "We think that our ideas will be helpful where they are made in respect to the race question of the South. It is a commandment of God. It is a commandment of God with us that there should be no amalgamation between the white race and the black race, and that each race should be taught to preserve itself from amalgamation. All who would encourage the notion of social equality or sexual relations," he said, "between these races would be no friend of the South, nor either race in part of America. The heaviest church disabilities would result from the contraction of such views." Well, the New Orleans Times-Democrat, however, editorialized that what they perceived to be Roberts' pandering on the question of race. Speaking to the South, they stated that they did not need the polygamously inclined followers of Joe Smith to hold that miscegenation is a crime of the first magnitude. Indeed, the paper concluded, between the polygamous tendency which Roberts represents and the tendency toward miscegenation which he condemns, there is not much of a wide moral gulf, as he seems to think. Both are inimical to society and cannot be too strongly rebuked. Well, unfortunately, Roberts' views became, and others, became part of the priesthood denial which the First Presidency in 1912 labeled as a foundation of church policy. And yet Roberts was more than these flaws. Anyone admits that, including me, and he remains an important figure. Leonard Arrington called Roberts the intellectual leader of the Mormon people in the era of Mormonism's finest intellectual attainment. Arrington also said that while Roberts was not a trained historian, he significantly influenced the way most Mormons thought about their history by making use of primary sources early on. I think arguably he had an impact on the beginnings of what we would call the new Mormon history that began some 50 years ago. Sterling McMurrin, who knew Roberts as a young man, he was a young man, and heard him speak, and if you want, I'll tell you a story about that, called Roberts the most interesting and exciting and stimulating person in church leadership, its most prolific writer, its chief theologian and historian, and its most capable defender. McMurrin said Roberts wrote directly. It was always clear what he was driving at. B.H. Roberts was a complicated, controversial, and complex individual. Certainly he deserves ongoing study. So let me close this talk in the same way I end the book. The prominent American historian Eric Foner was asked once what he had learned as his study of Reconstruction had proceeded over the years. To paraphrase, he said that the fate of all historians was that no book was the final word. They expected that their work would be challenged and eventually superseded by the scholarship of others. As he observed, I have simply written the latest word, not the last word. Indeed. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and I will switch glasses so I can see you now. And if you have some questions or comments, oh, what a attractive group. I'd be happy to try to answer them. Yes, please.
Tell us the story.
Oh, okay, yeah. McMurrin says that in the Adams Ward in Los Angeles, Roberts came to visit. And he said, well, we really didn't need a microphone. We had one at the pulpit. And Roberts kept moving away from the microphone, didn't have a lapel mic like I do. And the bishop would say, Brother Roberts, finally, McMurrin says he slammed the podium with his cane and said, we even have those damn things in the tabernacle. We don't need them. They're a curse. And went on with his talk. And the bishop didn't engage him. He said for years after, people would come up and look at the dent that cane had made on the podium and say, that's where B.H. Roberts. And he said they said that Roberts made his point so forcefully that his false teeth flew out. He captured his false teeth in one hand, popped them in his mouth, and went on with the sermon. Good story. Cal Rampton told me it happened in Centerville, or Bountiful. Good story. Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. Good story. Questions or comments? Please.
The thoughts about blacks being less valid in the pre-existence are you aware of, did B.H. Roberts seem to originate that concept, or is he parroting stuff that would have been common in the time?
I don't think he originated it. I think he built on some attitudes that were aware, that, were around John Taylor and Procre Price, other things. But I think I didn't get into this, and there's some of it in the book, but he had an interesting relationship with blacks. In some ways, he was very deferential to blacks. In other ways, he wasn't deferential. He didn't want to have much to do with them. They were proselytizing among blacks in the South, and many joined. Many, some. The person that took his photo as a tramp was a black photographer. On the other hand, I think that he really honestly believed, and he would often quote Southern apologists of the Civil War and race in support of his view. I think he honestly believed that separation of the races was right. At one time he said the blacks have much to thank white people for, because their lot in life is much better here than if they were still in the Congo or someplace else, and they ought to appreciate it and understand it. Now, it's easy from the perspective of 2021 to criticize that, not to say that there aren't still a few people around who would probably agree with that, unfortunately. But, and I'm not trying to impose on Roberts our current views. That's the concept of presentism, where you try to go back. And I'm not trying to do that. I'm just sort of laying it out. And it's one of the things that had long-term consequences. He wasn't the only one involved in it, but he was involved. Yeah. Norm.
So we know you wrestled around to get this wonderful book finished. Can you share with us a couple of the most difficult, had to go back and rewrite it, and find some new sources and that kind of thing that you faced?
It was an ongoing process, as Gary knows. I turned in a manuscript of typescript of nearly 1,000 pages. Now, I thought it was 1,000 perfect pages. There was a little division of opinion and signature over that. And they not only went out, they were right. It needed to be cut. And so and I just decided I was going to find everything I could, throw it in, and if it got cut, it got cut. The final manuscript, the whole nearly 1,000 pages, is at the library among my papers at Weber State. And so there's some things in there that make the book. So one of the questions was, to answer your question, what to leave in and what to cut, and I really think the editing was well done. I had absolutely no problems with the way it turned out. But that was one issue. An author likes to think that every word he writes just rolls, and that wasn't true. The other thing that was hard for me, because I was trying to see every source I could, I was lucky. If I'd have done this 20 years ago, I'd have been younger, but a lot of sources, or 20 years before this, a lot of sources wouldn't have been available. And I could find a lot of sources just on my desktop. The church was good in terms of allowing me access to some things. They weren't allowing me complete access. The one thing that they did not let me see, and I have no doubt but it would have changed a great deal, was his correspondence. It's just voluminous, his correspondence. On the one hand, if I'd have seen that, I'm sure I would have learned more about Roberts, and I would have changed some of my views, no doubt, would have found new information. On the other hand, we'd be having this talk in 2025. And so I struggled with that. And what I say in the book, and what I mean is, there are two bodies of sources that hopefully someday someone else that comes along after me to write again the latest word will have access to that correspondence. And the other thing that I hope they'll have access to that I didn't have access to is the collection of research materials that Truman Madsen gathered when he did his book in 1980. Some people think I quote Madsen a little too much, and they may be right. But Madsen makes assertions that I can't find anywhere else. Now, I take him at face value. He doesn't have footnotes, and I say this is what Madsen said. But he talked to a lot of those missionaries that had served under Roberts, and talked to his secretary, Elsie Cook, and others. And hopefully they're in private hands. I'm told that ultimately they will be made available. So I think if I'd had access to both those, it would have been a much longer process, but I'm sure it would have been a better process. The next person to come along hopefully will have that. Please.
I was at an MHA conference a number of years ago, and as I recall, his book, and I might get the order wrong, The Way, the Truth, the Life.
That's the truth, the way, the life.
Okay, I always get it wrong. Anyway, 2 editions of it showed up on the very same day. I think BYU Studies and I believe Signature Books, and it had been suppressed. You know, wasn't allowed to be published. Could you just kind of go over that story?
I can go over it a little.
Story. Yeah.
As I say, that's the theology that I didn't feel competent to really discuss. Remind me to say, there's another part of that, in case I forget. It was his masterwork, and he worked on it a long time, and it went to the church leaders and back and forth, and ultimately was never published by the church. The church allowed him, I can't remember exactly how long he stayed in New York, but they allowed him to stay after he was released as the mission president. He lived in New York, up on Riverside Drive, close to the New York Public, and Elsie Cook stayed as his secretary during that period. He worked on it and then came home, and that's when he kind of he got it all together. Gary Bergera might be able to answer that a little bit too, more cogently than me. What I do remember about those 2 books coming out at the same time, I don't know it was the exact same day, but they were the exact same time. Leonard Arrington has an essay in the book that Signature published. And I said to him, well, Leonard, which of the 2 is the best? And he said, well, I really think the Signature edition is better than the BYU Studies edition. Oh, the one that has your essay in it, Leonard, right. So I leave that to theologians more smarter than I am. There is another manuscript that we decided not to include, a body of scholarship, because again, it really deals with that theology and those questions. A young lady named Shannon Caldwell Montez did a master's thesis at the University of Nevada, Reno. Very readable, on the internet. Easily to find, just type in her name and you can find it and download it. Very good that way. Discussing a series of secret meetings that Roberts had in 1922, was it? Yeah, 22. And after he had come home after, before he was called as, no.
Before mission president.
He was, before he was called as the mission president, then he was called, and then anyway, she argues some very interesting stuff. And if you're interested in that, you ought to look at it. As I say, I included it in the bibliography, but I didn't really deal with her ideas. We talked once, and she said she thought the church was trying to hide things from her. I said, my goodness. Crime in Casablanca? And I said, well, they probably are. You know, there are things they're not going to let you see. There are things they're not going to let me see. So, but like everything, it has her point of view, like my book has mine. Other questions or comments? Gary, are you still here? Oh. Do you want to say anything about that?
About the Truth, the Way, the Life?
Yeah, and the theology.
Well, the Truth, the Way, the Life was really, the signature version of that was really Stan Larson. He was the mover on that particular project.
Right.
And I think that when the manuscript became available from the church or whoever, that there were these 2 competing projects. That BYU Studies got behind it and that we got behind. And I think it was just coincidental that they happened to happen at the same time. I'm sure that we were both aware that there was somebody else was working on a project, and they are kind of different. I mean, there are things in the signature Smith-Pettit version that aren't in the other version, and vice versa.
Vice versa, yeah.
Jim Allen has a really good essay in the BYU Studies version, and he had access to the minutes of the Quorum of the 12 during that period of time, so he's able to provide a lot more context to the production of that particular manuscript.
Yeah.
But they're competing and they're also complementary, I think.
That's a good way of saying it.
Yeah.
And the text itself is not that different, but the editorial commentary in each are worth reading both. And you're right, Jim's is excellent. Other
I
questions?
got a question.
Yeah, Chris.
Maybe you covered this in the book and I didn't see it, but are there individuals that were like his assistants, secretaries, that have some kind of published account of their time with Roberts?
Yeah, there are a few who have written about it. Henry D. Taylor, in his memoirs, talks about it. There are others who've written vignettes. There's some oral histories that Gordon Irving did where people will talk about their experiences with BH. What I discovered was if you came into contact with B.H. Roberts, you wrote about it. You wrote home, Martha, guess who I saw today? And the journals, their diaries and journals and letters always mention contact with Roberts. And generally favorable. I've yet to find one of those sources that says he is no good, with one exception. One woman missionary said, his speeches were very good. They were also very long. So I'm trying to keep that in mind. But yeah, there are things. And, you know, I don't want anybody to think that the church really threw a roadblock in my research. Tell you one story. I was down there researching, and I look up, there's Mike Quinn. Hey, Mike, if you and I are here, there's some holes in this security system. And that's one of the best things about this project. Mike and I have known each other for a long, long time, but we hadn't seen each other for a long time. We kind of reconnected when he was working there and I was working there. And I went to lunch a couple of times, and I am so glad for that because, as you know, Mike's no longer with us. But, yeah. Other questions or comments? Please.
Janet asked, could you just share a couple of thoughts perhaps about the studies of the Book of Mormon that he authored and, you know, came out much later, but there was that one. I'm not sure I'm naming it.
It is. Again, I didn't really, I mean, I've kind of read in it, but I didn't really concentrate on it because it was a little different than what I was interested in. But you should get a copy and read the editorial, the editing and the commentary by Brigg Matson. It's a fine volume. The people that kept Roberts alive, Brigg was one, Sterling McBurn was another, and Sterling really regretted that by the 70s, lots of interest in Roberts had waned because the people that really knew him were dying. And he was really glad that there was a resurgence of interest. The B.H. Roberts Society was one of those, the publication of some of these things that you're talking about. And McMurrin said that he was pleased because he thought, as he says, he was its most capable defender, but also its most stimulating person, and he was pleased. I can't remember exactly when Sterling died, a few years ago, but in his books there's some really good stuff on the theology. Yes, Gary.
So, John, if you could spend an hour or two with BH, what would you ask him?
Well, I think the first question would be, why in the world, because you obviously want to run for office, why in the world did you oppose suffrage? Did you honestly believe that it would endanger statehood? And at one point, as I say, he could be disingenuous. He said, well, you keep on trying, and you may do such a good job, you might even convince me, and I can get around. And then when he ran, he was, oh my God, there'll be nobody in Congress more fervently in favor of women's suffrage. So I'd ask him a couple of questions about that. I'd want to know when he really got married. That'd be a good question, you know. He said it was before the manifesto. Well, Wilford Woodruff says that in the months before the manifesto, there had been marriages performed that he didn't approve of. Was that one of them? Most people believe it was after the manifesto. The other thing that sort of bothers me about Roberts is, you know, he tells the Smoot hearings, he didn't tell either Louisa or Celia of the marriages for 2 or 3 years. Well, he continued to have children with both Louisa and Celia from 1890 to, well, 1902, when his last child was born. So I really would like to know that story. Suffrage, the marriages. I think the third thing, and this would be mostly me, well, the two things. The third thing would be, tell me why you really backed away from politics. Because they're constantly saying to BH, run for governor, run for senator, and he says, no, I don't want to raise the old issues and stuff. But he clearly is very involved in a lot of ways, kind of as an advisor more than anything else. And he told Henry Taylor, I'd have been a pretty good congressman. Now, you say pretty good congressman, that's kind of a low standard that you have to meet. But I think he would have been. He would have. He was a smart, well-educated for a poor boy guy. He was a lifelong learner. So I'd want to ask him about that. What was the third? Oh, I would say to B.H. Roberts, son, can you tell me how you survived basic training at 60? I could barely survive it when I was 22. I stand literally all amazed at that. And they said to him, we can get you out of this? He said, no, by golly, I want to do everything the boys. So he's a complicated guy, and I hope I haven't painted a negative picture of Roberts, because you know, the balance sheet is much more on the positive side than the negative. But every once in a while, and then he writes about his mission to Iowa. He writes these 3 articles. Well, I read them. Oh, this is great. Well, he misses the dates off. He's got them in the wrong place. And, oh, boy, you know, could you have been a little more consistent? So, good question. Others? Yes, sir.
As an author, do you finance all your own research and the time, or do you have others who help back you so you can do what you really like doing?
That's a very good question. Let me answer it in 2 ways. One is I got a huge amount of help in a variety of ways from the signature folks. Huge amount in terms of that I didn't, you know, editorial and all kinds of things. But I also was able, since the last 8 years of my career were in the history department at Weaver, they were so good to me, I can't imagine it. They were supportive, they'd listen to me, and I could explore ideas with them and all that, and that was very helpful. But more to the point, they gave me travel money. I mean, don't tell anybody that, because I just damn adjunct. But they did. They said, well, we think of you as a full faculty member, and here, you got X number of dollars. And so I was able to use that to travel and do some things. And I had an office, and I had secretary, and I thank the secretary, both secretaries and the techie in that school, who saved me repeatedly. As this Luddite was wandering in the cyber world he is unfortunately stuck in. Shouldn't be living in this century. Not my cup of tea. All apps and technology and all this. And I could just call and, you know, well, can you come down and see what I've done? Yeah, do this. Okay, go. So I had a lot of support that way. It was practical support, but much more than in the library. It was also intellectual support. They said, oh yeah, this is a great project. We want to hear about it. Yeah.
Couldn't Roberts speak in general conference and then the next speaker got up and kind of contradicted him, or are you familiar with that story?
I'm not. Wouldn't surprise me, you know. He was an interesting guy. He rubbed people the wrong way, and yet they loved him. Heber J. Graham tells Richard Roberts, my late colleague's dad, Harold, he says, what will I do without him? J. Golden Kimball says, hey, he make me crazy, but when he died, I just feel like there's a vacancy in my life. I had my own encyclopedia just in the next office. All I had to do was ask him a question and he had an answer. Even Joseph F. Smith, with whom he quarreled quite frequently, Republican versus Democrat, said that his expulsion from Congress was by absolute just politics. There was nobody in Congress more free from the taint of corruption than B.H. Roberts. So, interesting. The only story I know that's apocryphal, J. Golden Kimball. J. Golden Kimball story, right? The story was that Kimball went to the cemetery. Roberts is buried in Centerville. And it was just a fairly new, reasonably new, but not a very well-developed cemetery. And the story goes that B.H. Roberts got up there and looked out from the cemetery and looked around and said, this is a hell of a place to bury one of the Lord's anointed. Well, according to Heber J. Grant, J. Golden Kimball was excused from the funeral because he was ill at home. So if he didn't go to the funeral, he probably didn't go to the cemetery. Now, a couple of years later, his missionaries and some other folks erected a grave. Statesman, churchman, and soldier, it says on his grave. And it could have been that Kimball was there when the grave was, and he said it then. But I don't know. J. Golden Kimball stories, we could go on forever with those. We haven't got that much time. Other questions or comments? Well, thank you very much. You've touched me greatly. Thanks for being there. Thanks for buying the book. Thanks for your good questions and comments. Now I'll mask up so Chris doesn't slap me upside the head.